Thank you for choosing American Pest CEUs. Hi, I'm Sean Reeves. I'm an Associate Certified Entomologist with American Pest CEUs. I've been in the pest management industry since 1999, and I'll be your instructor for today's course. Today's course is titled Performing Rodent Exclusions with Sheet Metal. Part 1, the Inspection. When it comes to performing exclusion work with sheet metal, the first thing we need to look for is roof return entry points. This is where sheet metal can help us out the most when performing an exclusion. Let's look a little closer at these roof return entry points. Now, as you can see here, we were inspecting a roof of a home and we found two areas where rodents were entering the structure from the roof line. As you can see on the left, we found a spot where there's a roof return, and what I mean by roof return is this is where two different elevations meet on a roof. So as you can see on the picture on the left, we've got a spot where the rodents lifted up the soffit vent, and we stuck a yellow magic marker in there just to show exactly where the rodents were getting in and how big the gap was. This is a common example of a roof return entry point where rodents can just make their way right into the attic of a structure. As you can see on the right, we're dealing with the same thing. Once again, the rodents made their way up the shingles, worked their way in, and got inside this structure through a roof return entry point. Now, before we talk about the sheet metal solution, I think it's important that you see what bad exclusion work looks like. So there's a lot of different ways to do exclusion. The problem is they're not all equal. As you can see here, when I inspected this home, I saw some really bad exclusion work. Basically, what happened here is somebody went up there with some hardware cloth and some yellow foam. They tucked hardware cloth up into that roof return, and then they yellow foamed it in. And then after that, for some strange reason, they decided to use a bunch of black paint up there. I can understand the black paint to a point, but as you can see here, the black paint went way too far out and just really made a mess when it comes to the aesthetics of this roof return. Also, and I'm not showing you in this image, this wasn't stopping the rodents either. So not only did this look terrible aesthetically, this also wasn't even solving the rodent problem. Now, when it comes to performing the sheet metal exclusion, as you can imagine, there's certain materials and tools that we're going to need. First and foremost, we're going to need a roll of sheet metal. Many of you may already have an idea of what type of sheet metal you want to use. Obviously, you can go somewhere like Lowe's or Home Depot and get a roll of sheet metal, as well as there's a lot of local suppliers. Just make sure when you're working with sheet metal, you get a gauge thick enough that rodents can't push their way through, as well as not too thick, because you do need something you can work with, because we're going to be using tools like a metal brake to make sure we bend the angles correctly for the box out exclusions we're getting ready to do. Next, we're going to need a pair of 10 snips. So as you can imagine, when we're working with the sheet metal, we're going to need something to cut the sheet metal with. These 10 snips work great. Some people like the straight ones, some people like the ones that are more offset or a combination thereof. I love the ones you're seeing on the screen here. I like a big pair that's longer because I think they're easier to work with, but either way, you get the idea. These 10 snips are going to be very valuable when it comes to cutting the sheet metal. Another important tool that we always want to make sure we have on our service vehicle is a tape measure. Especially when it comes to working on rodent exclusions with sheet metal, a tape measure is going to be very important because there's going to be a lot of different things we have to measure when it comes to the opening and the sheet metal we're going to work with. So always make sure you come prepared with a tape measure. The next tool of importance we're going to need is a cordless drill. You're definitely not going to be able to screw your sheet metal in when you perform this box out exclusion without a cordless drill. Always make sure you have a cordless drill with you on your service vehicle and that the batteries are charged. Nothing is worse than getting out to a job site and realizing your battery's dead. Then you're going to have to start all over again, get a charged battery, and then you're going to have the issue of having to chase tools around, and that's never fun when you're on a job site. Then we're going to need a pack of self-tapping screws. Now as you can see here, we're showing a self-tapping screw that'll drill right into the existing sheet metal or whatever you're drilling into and tap itself right in there like a drill bit, as well as it has the hex head. Now you're going to want to make sure you have the correct nut driver to fit into your drill to screw the hex head in. So just make sure the size of your hex head and what nut driver you're going to need for the extension for your drill. But this is what we're going to use to screw our new sheet metal in as we make our box out for the rodent exclusion. With our next set of tools, we're going to need to be able to bend the metal. As you can see here, we've got two types of metal bending tools. Over on the left, we've got a handheld metal brake. This is a simple metal brake that you can even take up on a roof with you. Now I know some of you may have big hand brakes you use on the ground, and that works as well. But for today's exercise, we're just going to look at the smaller one you can take up on the roof. On the right, you have the metal bending pliers. These are about 6 inches wide at the jaws. This is a nice tool as it allows you to take a small, lightweight tool up there and bend metal, especially when you got smaller areas. I would suggest using both of these on most jobs, but you have to keep in mind every job's different, and if you can do it easier with one or the other and don't need both, that works as well. Another tool we're going to need to use is a carpenter's pencil. This is going to help you cut the sheeting when and where you need to cut it, but this is going to work very well, this flat style pencil, for some of the tricks we're going to need to use when cutting the metal. So just keep in mind that you definitely want it to be a flat carpenter's pencil. After that, we're going to need to make sure we have a pair of sheet metal gloves. I say a pair, make sure you have extra pairs on the truck, but this is something that's going to protect your hands as you're cutting the sheet metal. If you've never worked with sheet metal, you may not know this, but when you're cutting the metal, it gets very sharp on the edges, and you can get portions that hang a little bit while you're cutting it, little slivers, things like that. So you're going to have to be really careful when cutting this, and you definitely want to make sure you wear these sheet metal style gloves because they will protect your hands and make sure that you don't get those cuts. Another important tool we're going to need when performing our rodent exclusion box out is a good ladder. As you can see here, we've got a ladder propped up against a house. Now this ladder is extending 3 feet above the edge of the surface we're going to be climbing on, so this is per OSHA guidelines. You're always going to want to make sure you follow OSHA guidelines when dealing with a ladder. Also remember, when we're dealing with OSHA guidelines, for every 4 feet of height on the ladder, the height that it goes up against the house, we're going to need to back the bottom of the ladder out 1 foot from the foundation. So keep in mind, if you're going 12 feet tall, you're going to need to back the bottom of that ladder out 3 feet from the bottom foundation. This ensures you've got a pitch that's going to keep you safe, and it's a lot less likely that you're going to fall off this ladder and get injured. Another protection device that I highly suggest is a ladder stabilizer. As you can see here, this is a standard ladder we put up against the house. It's just extended out above the roof line as we talked about, but it's also got a ladder stabilizer added. This is just another great safety feature for companies that I think you should look at, because at the end of the day, the last thing we want to see is somebody fall. And of course, as you can imagine, outside of the human aspect of that, this would leave us open to lawsuits that we don't want to deal with. So anything we can do, like adding a ladder stabilizer, is only going to help protect people and protect our companies against liability. Real quickly, as we're talking about ladder safety and just creating a safety culture as a company overall, you need to understand how to walk up a ladder. I know this sounds like a simple concept, but the reality is a lot of times you're going to have something in your hand, you're going to be in a hurry, you got a lot of stops going that day. You need to make sure you think about safety first. So as we're going to see here in the video, the technician climbs the ladder 1 step at a time, making sure they have an anchored foot on 1 step, and then they pull the other foot up. Always making sure they also have one hand anchored on the ladder. So in this case, the person is right-handed, so their left hand is always anchored on a rung of the ladder above where they're stepping, and then again, they have an anchor foot that'll go up a step. Then the second foot will come up once they make sure their hand and other foot's anchored. all the way up to the top until you see them get to the point where they lean over the top of the ladder, make sure they get an anchor foot on the roof, and then lean their weight into the roof and make sure their weight is pushing forward, never backward, so they never have to worry about falling off that roof because they're anchored with their hands and their feet, and then of course taking their weight and leaning it into the roof when they get to the top to make sure that they don't get injured or fall down. Next, we're going to look at surveying the exclusion area. At this point, as a rodent technician, you understand the materials and tools you're going to need to perform the box out exclusion. We're up on the roof and we need to look at the exclusion area we're going to be working at. We need to survey this area and we need to understand what we're dealing with. Now, the one you're looking at here, this is actually a rodent exclusion we performed where we went out to the job site. Somebody else had already done exclusion work and had done a really bad job. So not only are we going to have to perform a rodent exclusion, but we're actually going to have to fix some of the previous work that was done because it's just not doing the job. And as you can see, it does not look good at all. Our technician we're going to be working with today is Tristan Crosby at Prodigy Pest Solutions. Now you've already seen he surveyed the area, looked at the work that has to be done. Now we're going to see Tristan start prepping the area for the exclusion work. Again, in this case, he's going to have to remove some of the old exclusion work to be able to do it correctly. Next, we're going to see Tristan as he measures his soffit for his first cut. So as you can see here, he's going to position himself. He's going to use the tape measure. This is going to give us the length of the soffit and give us an idea for our first cut. Then Tristan is going to come down off of the roof and he's going to go down and open his flashing. Now you need to think about this. In theory you should be wearing gloves, but no matter if you're wearing the gloves or not, be careful when you open this because it can wind open really quickly as you see here. Now in our next step, Tristan is going to start measuring and cutting the flashing. As you can see here, he's going to roll it out, so obviously you need a good flat surface to work on. You're always going to deal with the roll, doing what you're seeing here. But as he gets it laid out and gets it flat enough he can work with it, you're going to see basically he used one of his pair of snips there to kind of keep it at bay. And now Tristan is getting his tape measure. So now we're going to go into the measuring portion of the flashing itself. So as you can see here, Tristan's laying out his tape measure. Now he did explain one thing to me before this. He said that he knows he needs about a 23-inch piece, so he's going to cut it at 26. He explained to me that that gives him an extra 3 inches to work with, and it makes it pretty easy when he gets back on the roof. Yes, he's still going to have to do some trimming and things like that, but because he only needs the 23 inches, it's going to be a lot easier to work with starting at 26. Now that Tristan made his mark at 26 inches, he's going to go ahead and draw the rest of the line across the flashing. This is going to help him prepare for the cut to make sure he has a reasonably straight line. He didn't use a square like I probably would have, but at the end of the day you can kind of see he got it straight enough. And when we're working on something like this, it doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to be trimming it again anyways. As you can see here, Tristan's carefully cutting the flashing itself. Tristan is going to now flatten out our piece of flashing to work with, so it's flat, so it's a little bit easier to work with. And now we have our first piece of flashing to work with. So for this job, we actually had a portable metal brake, one that was kind of on a table setup. So we were able to put this in the driveway. And as you can see here, we've got our metal piece that Tristan's put in the brake itself. Now obviously, when you're working with something like a metal brake, you're going to have to work a little bit with getting the metal in there. So there's a thin spacing in the metal brake for you to slide the metal through. So you can see that Tristan's having to work his way through getting the metal through that little thin area. And as he's getting it set up, he's getting it in position to do the brake as he wants it to be. As you can see here, he's looking at the back side, making sure how much of the bend's on the other side. So he's going to be bending it into an L shape. He just wanted to make sure that he had enough on the back side to get where he wanted to go. I think he's getting pretty close to where he's going to be able to actually push the levers and do the brake itself, do the bend. Let's see. Working on getting our bend done here. So obviously he's pushing down on the top side to make sure that that bend is perfectly flat all the way across. And as he lifts this up, you can see we got our first bend. So now we got our first bent piece of metal to work with. And now Tristan's back on the roof. So at this point, he's got his first piece of sheet metal up there, making sure that the bend is following the contour of the soffit itself. And he's looking to see where he needs to make his first cut. So right now he's getting an idea of where he needs to make his first trim of the piece. What Tristan explained to me he's doing here is he's looking to see how much he needs to take off at the bottom. So obviously our metal piece needs to go closer to the exclusion area itself to have a good box out. So he's got a pretty good idea of now how much he wants to take off at the bottom, and he's going to trim that bottom out. I do want you to see he is using a pair of offset 10 snips, so it's probably a good idea to have some straight ones and some offset ones for these longer cuts. And obviously, again, he's cutting this slowly, making sure he doesn't get cut, making sure he doesn't make any mistakes here. And now we've got our metal piece, so we've got it nicely trimmed out, so we've got a much shorter piece, so that when he does go back up and look into this area, you can see now that our exclusion piece is in a much better position. We really don't need it to be bigger than it needs to be, but we can see how it slid up into the area we need to cover. But also you can see there's nothing showing there. Like you may remember in the beginning we showed that nasty black paint. That's gone now. As you can see now, he's showing it, it's gone. So now what Tristan's doing is he's taking a little bit more off just to make sure he gets it as far up in there as he can to make sure that he covers the area, but then again still doesn't do it too much. I'd love to tell you that you're not going to have to make multiple cuts on something like this, but the reality is it's always going to be different when you're doing a box out on exclusion. So in this case, he couldn't eyeball it perfect the first time, so he did have to make a second cut, and that's going to be pretty common for all of us. And once again, sliding the exclusion material right up into the spot. Now you can see he's got it pretty snug in there. We're in a good position. He's actually taken that carpenter's pencil we spoke about earlier when we talked about the tools and making a line across the bottom. So what he's trying to do here is he's trying to make a line along the bottom to know where he's going to make his final snip there. He only went up to the hip of the roof there too. So you're going to see later he's going to have to make a second piece added onto this because there's that hip in the center there. So a lot of times you're going to have one flat area to work with, but now he's marking out the hip because it's a different elevation. He's actually going to have to use a second metal piece just under this soffit to cover that area correctly. I really like how this is fitting in. You can tell it's going to fit very well and look very good once it's done just by looking at where he's at now. This was not the easiest exclusion either with that hip. It was definitely another obstacle to work around, and it did add time to the job as a whole and just made it where you really had to make sure that you worked two different pieces as I was just mentioning. So now he's going to cut this piece so that he has the first metal piece, which is going to go up to the hip itself. And he's also trimming out the bottom. So you may remember he was marking with that carpenter's pencil, kind of taking it, kind of putting it flat on the shingles and doing the mark along the bottom. So this was actually showing him where he could make his final trim on that metal piece so that it was as flush as possible at the bottom. And once again, we're sliding it back into the area there. As you can see, we're getting a very nice flush fit now. So it's starting to come together. It's starting to fit very well. And now Tristan's doing a pencil test just to see if there's any gaps at the bottom. He explained to me that if the pencil fits under the bottom, that a rodent could get in, but if the pencil didn't fit under that bottom, you were good to go and you were ready to continue your exclusion work.
Generally, rule of thumb for me is if you can't fit the pencil underneath it, then they're not going to get in there. Over here, that's fine.
Got it. Because you can't get a perfect cut. I mean, it's almost impossible, but...
Unless you're trying to spend all day doing it.
Yeah.
Got tools for angles and more advanced stuff, and maybe, but...
It's defeating your purpose.
For what we're doing, it's not necessary.
In the next step, you're going to see Tristan install our first piece of sheet metal. Obviously, he's going to be using his drill, and he's going to be using the hex head tech screws that we talked about when we talked about our tools for the job.
It's only poking out right there because of the bend we put on it, but I'll fix that when we do the side piece.
I want you to notice that the spacing between the screws that Tristan put in is about 4 inches. Everybody would probably wonder how far apart they should be, and you can see here 4 inches is enough to make sure that our first piece of sheet metal exclusion is anchored well. At this point, Tristan's going to size up with his eyes the second piece of sheet metal. In the next clip, Tristan is going to be measuring the second metal rodent exclusion piece. You can see where his left knee is, that hip right there. That's what's causing him to have to measure a second piece to go under the same soffit. I kind of mentioned that earlier, but I wanted you to see why. So he's basically trying to figure out how to take 2 pieces and use them on that same side under the soffit, because there was just really no good way to do one continuous piece.
So this for me will be about 11 inches.
All right, now you were telling me because we got a hip coming down off the roof here. What did you just say, Tristan?
So you don't always have to do this in 2 pieces. You can rather cut one big piece and then try to figure out these angles. I personally just find that makes it harder. But so you can overlap it to do the same thing. But it's only because of this ridge right here that we're cutting this into 2 pieces so we can get the metal to come down this angle here. Excellent. But if you don't have a ridge right there and it's
just a standard flat section, normal, yeah,
then you can typically do this in 1 piece just like that to run it all the way out to the fascia, and it'll be, you know, flat the same length all the way across the bottom, and then we do the side plate.
And there's always a degree of difficulty with these jobs. So when you're doing an inspection and when you're planning the work, you have to understand when you have a hip coming up like this, that made the job more difficult. It added time and labor to the job.
The second piece is just to finish this run here. It's going to run straight out all the way to the fascia and then angle down this roof here. So this next piece is going to go from here down this angle to here. It'll come past a little bit. That's where we're going to bend it again here on this side, because when we put the next piece up, the next piece is going to run from here all the way across this side to the corner over here underneath the drip edge. So when we put this extra bend on the second piece, that's just to give us a surface to screw into for the side plate. Now sometimes you might put an extra bend on the side right here because like there's a little gap right here. Sometimes on houses they will have a little indent across the side here. So sometimes you put an extra snip into the side right here so that you will have a lower piece that sticks out a little bit farther and can fit into that gap, and then the excess on the top half I just bend so it sits flush against the wall.
At this point, Tristan's back down at the metal brake and he's working on piece number 2. So we're going to do our bend for piece number 2. As you can see, he's working right now on the metal brake. And once again, Tristan's back on top, and we're taking that second piece that we're going to add to the first piece, and he's eyeballing it up, just seeing where he needs to start trimming it out. So as you're going to see here, Tristan's trying to measure both sides of this roof hip. So one side of the metal piece we're going to add is going to have to be the size that he's showing on the right side of the hip. And then you're going to see here in just a moment, he's going to go over to the other side, because obviously with the different contour there of that hip, it's going to be a different length. Then he's going to have to follow the contour of the metal across the bottom to get over that hip to make sure that it fits correctly and that the rodents can't get back in those areas. At this point you can see Tristan's measuring to make his cuts on metal piece 2. So obviously we got to make sure we get the length right on this. And this is where he's going to start working over that contour of the hip, making sure that he gets the one side at the one length and the other side at the other length. Now anybody that's ever done this type of work is going to tell you it's a tedious process. So again, Tristan's measuring again just to make sure he knows exactly where he's at. At this point, Tristan's still marking metal piece 2 for the contour around that hip. It's quite a process. There's more than one side to it, and he's having to mark it one side at a time. You can also see that he's marking the other side now. So again, we got measurements on one side, we got measurements on the other side. He's having to mark them both. Okay, after that long part of the process, now we're ready to cut the contour. So you can kind of see with the marking here that Tristan's going to start cutting along that contour of the hip. So you're going to watch as he cuts along the pattern. Once he gets this piece cut out, we're going to be able to take the second piece of metal here and we're going to be able to match it up to the first piece right over top of that roof hip that we've been discussing. And there it is. Now you can see what Tristan did at the bottom. He left a piece hanging that he could bend. So you can see the bent piece over on the bottom left by his left hand. And you can also see how he's now going to remove that. So that he knows perfectly now that this piece is fitting that contour of the hip on the roof. At this point, it's setting into place pretty well. You can kind of see how it's fitting. You can see there is a little gap at the bottom. As you can see, there still is that part at the bottom that's going to have to be trimmed out. So basically, Tristan's going back over to his 10 snips, and he's going to trim out that bottom of that contour around the roof hip to make sure it fits just a little better and that the rodents can't get in the future. And there it is. That's definitely a much better fit than it was before. As you can see at this point, Tristan is actually working on the notch at the top. So he's going to notch around that fascia capping so that basically it ends right there at the end of the soffit. So he has a notch to work around that corner. And once again with the 10 snips, here's Tristan cutting out that notch around the fascia capping. At this point, we got our tab ready to go. Tristan's going to cut it with the 10 snips, get that out of our way. And there we go. We've got our notch cut out. And now we're ready to slide piece 2 back in. And just so everybody understands, there's going to be a lot of finessing to these types of projects. These are not easy to do. This is not something where you just make a cut, slam something in, and then it just fits together. There's a lot of back and forth. As you can see, we do have a nice fitting piece there and everything now. Tristan's working with the pencil just to make sure no rodents can get in. But this was a lot of work to get here. There's a lot of cuts, a lot of finessing, a lot of making sure things fit just perfectly. Instead of going back down off the roof, Tristan came up with an idea. He understands that on the one side of the notch, he has to bend that metal, and he said, you know what, I can do this right up on top of the roof. I can do it where the shingles and drip edge meet. I can just do it up here instead of going back down the ladder. Any of you that have done this for any period of time, or you'll see this in the future when you do, you don't want to keep going back up and down the ladder. So if there's any way you can save time and it's not going to damage the home or injure yourself, it's always a great idea to save time doing things like Tristan just did here. Once again, we've got a nice fit here. We got our piece sliding right in. We've got our notch. It's butting right up against the other piece. What a great fit, and that was a lot of work to get there, but it's nice to see it's coming together. And at this point, just like we did on the first metal piece, Tristan's putting the screws in. One thing of note is he only put the screw in on the right side because he wants that flexibility to be able to work with that piece of metal. So eventually he's going to screw it the rest of the way in, but he's looking for that flexibility. As you can see, there's still more work to be done on the left side of metal piece 2. At this point, Tristan is going to screw the 2 metal pieces together to firm them up. There's really no other way to do it. They have to be attached because obviously we had to use 2 independent pieces to go over that roof hip. So you can see here he's popping screws in there to make sure that area stays firm. You're probably noticing he's applying a little pressure on the back side of this with his left hand as well, because you can't screw a screw in without some pressure in the back. Just make sure if you're doing this, you watch your hands, because it's very easy to put a screw right through your hand when you're in a situation like this. At this point, our second piece of sheet metal's in and ready for the final screws. And there we go. We got a solid piece. We've got 2 of our 3 metal pieces done at this point. And now we're ready to start measuring our third piece of metal. This is going to be metal piece 3 for those of you that have been keeping track. So this is the final piece that's going to tie off that front edge and seal up the rest of this rodent exclusion area with our box out. Now you can see here Tristan's using a pencil and doing some markings a little bit differently here. Everybody's going to have their own way of doing it, but basically he followed the contour of the drip edge here to get those markings on either side, and now he's going right along the back where the shingles and the roof line is. And we're right back to the metal exclusion part 3. We're laying it out, we're going to make sure it's flat, and once again Tristan's got the 10 snips out and he's going to cut that contour he just marked. And we're now ready to put our third piece of the rodent sheet metal exclusion in place. Now obviously we're still going to have to do some more work to it. As you can see here with Tristan, he's still working on it, making it all fit. But look how close it came out just from that initial measurement where he followed the contour of that drip edge in the roof line. Now as you can see here, as Tristan's getting it into place, the pencil's fitting underneath, and we talked about this before. This is a concern because that means the rodents are also going to be able to get underneath. So we're always doing the pencil test to see where we're at, as well as he's marking the edge of where to cut the third piece where it meets piece 2. At this point, Tristan's going to make that cut that he just marked. And now you're seeing what a nice tight fit we get. And you can see how this box out's coming together. It's really starting to look good. I mean, this is totally different than if somebody did work with hardware cloth and foam. You can see we're still going to need to trim out the bottom, but just the fact of how this is already looking just gives you an idea of where we're going. Now, Tristan right now is taking the pencil flat on the shingles and marking the areas he needs to trim. So once again, this is going to help him trim out the correct areas to make it fit and to make sure the rodents don't have future access underneath this piece of sheet metal. And I think he's just about got it all marked. And again, you can see there's going to be some areas on either end, it looks like, that are going to need to be trimmed, whereas the middle itself is already pretty low. And of course, Tristan's going to follow the line he just drew on there, trimming out both sides, making sure that it's all flush when he gets done so that the rodents do not have access anywhere where that sheet metal meets the shingle line. He actually starts by cutting up into the sheet metal to get up to where his line is here. And this makes it easier for him to cut smaller pieces and then go ahead and pull them off instead of just trying to cut a big long stretch and having that piece of metal that's kind of bending up on him there. That's what you need to be careful of. A lot of what Tristan's doing is to protect himself from getting cut and just making sure that those sharp pieces of metal are smaller so that they don't roll up, because eventually if you have a long stretch you're going to end up cutting yourself if it keeps curling back over on you. Now as you can see here, this piece of metal is really coming together. I mean, it's really getting tight all the way across. I keep saying this, there's a lot of finessing to this job. There's a lot of making things fit, a lot of trimming. Once again, you're seeing the amount of time a job like this takes just by Tristan having to put a piece in, measure it, cut it, take it back out, check and see if there's any gaps, see what he has to trim, and finally he gets it where it needs to be. And at this point, as you can see, he's ready to screw in our third piece. And at this point, as you can see, he's ready to screw in our third piece of the sheet metal exclusion. He put a couple screws closer together, one into that fascia capping and then one right below it where sheet metal exclusion piece 2 is. That's just to make that joint strong since you're adjoining two pieces of sheet metal. This was a tougher exclusion, like I've been saying. This is not as simple as a lot of them where you would just work right underneath the soffit. Where he's had to join these three pieces together has taken him a lot of extra time. But I think it's good for you to see a tougher one like this, because an easier one that's just a standard smaller box out where you just have two pieces is going to be much easier for you. It's figuring out these harder ones like Tristan had to do here that's really going to make you really good at the job itself. Once again, he was struggling a little bit here with getting some pressure on the back and just making these two fit together. I shortened up this segment a little bit because it was so much trouble trying to screw into something where you really didn't have a base on the back, but at this point Tristan was able to make that final screw fit in. And as you can imagine, Tristan's going to come right across that top contour and screw it in all the way across to anchor our third metal exclusion piece down. Probably what strikes me the most is how well his measurements worked and how well that looks. That piece of sheet metal exclusion fit right up against that drip edge on the roof, and to me it looks great. There's no way to make these 100% perfect, but just looking at it so far it looks great to me. I think Tristan did a great job with making that contour work, cutting it right, and screwing it in correctly, as you can see here. As you can see now, Tristan's looking at that bottom area in the center. So he did trim up the sides a little bit, but it looks like that bottom area in the center still got a gap. This is something that we're concerned about because the last thing we want is for the rodents to have any type of access in the future. So he's basically just working on shoring that area up in the center. At this point, we got the main parts of the rodent exclusion box out done. As you can see here, it's formed a nice box. We've got it pretty well sealed up. Tristan is going to look at one last area though, because there is one area of concern we need to address. So Tristan is again sizing up the area in the center at the bottom of our third piece of metal rodent exclusion. And as you're going to see, he's going to cut out a little piece to protect that area. Tristan is once again going to be cutting out a little metal piece to protect the sheet metal rodent exclusion part 3, the piece right in front of him there. So you're going to see him cut a small piece that's going to go across that bottom middle. And the reason why I keep saying that this is about 25 feet up on a roof, nobody's ever going to know the difference with what he's doing here. And as you're going to see, it looks pretty good anyways. But this is what we had to do in this case to make sure that center area on the bottom of metal exclusion piece 3 was actually fully sealed up. Tristan's now finished up the metal piece as far as cutting it out. Now he's going to bend it into an L shape by hand. This is something that could be pretty simply accomplished with those 6-inch jaws pliers with the flat jaws. Unfortunately, we didn't have a pair of those, so Tristan's going to do some of this by hand, and then he's going to go over to the roof contour along the drip edge, and he's going to bend it the rest of the way, making sure we get a perfect L shape. Okay, and now Tristan's going to add our last little metal piece, the addition on the metal exclusion panel number 3, to make sure we seal up this last little area where rodents could have access to the attic. Our final step we added, finishing off roof metal exclusion panel number 3, is screwing it in. So you can see here, we put the additional piece, we screwed it in, and this is going to be all set. And that's going to be the end of the metal work for this rodent box out exclusion. Now there is one final step in our rodent exclusion box out. We're going to need to paint the metal. A lot of times this is accomplished by using spray paint, making sure you match it up as well as possible. In this case, the customer actually had some paint that matched their fascia capping that we were able to use. So sometimes that works out. Nothing's better than having a perfect match. But I would definitely say that you want to carry multiple colors on your service vehicle because you're going to run into a lot of the same colors you're going to use over and over again that will cover an area like this. I do want you to notice something else. Tristan is using a piece of the sheet metal as he rolls this paint on to protect the shingle area. You always want to make sure you protect areas that you don't want to paint. So in this case, he's coming right up to the bottom of the drip edge, you can see in brown there, and he's using that sheet metal as a shield to protect the shingles underneath. As many of you can understand, when it comes to rodent exclusions and any type of exclusion work, it needs to look good. If it doesn't look good, it's going to be a problem. Even 25 feet up, it has to look good. So Tristan's doing a great job here of making sure the paint goes where it needs to, but he doesn't get that paint in areas where it doesn't need to be. As you can see here, Tristan is finishing up the process of making sure that last metal piece we put on is painted well. And again, he's just making sure that he gets the strokes good all the way across. Now, as you can see, just looking at these before and after photos really brings it home. You can see when we first got to this job site, we were dealing with a mess. We were dealing with very bad rodent exclusion work, not just from a physical standpoint, but from the aesthetics of it. Absolutely nobody wants their house to look like that. So you can see on the left the before photo, and then look at this after photo. This is great exclusion work. This is a box out. This is the way rodent exclusion should be done when you can do it. Is this going to work on every home? Probably not. You're not always going to be able to do a box out, but when you can and when you can do it this way, it's just really stellar work. I would suggest everyone to look at doing box outs when it comes to rodent exclusion, and then still using your other techniques, whether it be hardware cloth and maybe using some foam. But understanding, anytime you can do a box out, it's going to be better work. Also, when you look at this box out from on the ground, 25 feet up the roof, and then of course you're even further down when you're on the ground, you would never even notice any of the flaws because it blended in so well. Congratulations, you have completed the course. Please proceed to the exam to receive your credit.